Even though it's near the middle of the Bible, Job is one of the oldest books. If you notice in the story of Job, there's nothing about priests. There's nothing about the law of Moses that has been given. There's nothing about kings or kingdoms. And likely the story takes place at or even maybe before the time of Abraham, based on the context of the passage. Now, if you've grown up in church, and whether it's not just church people, but just people in America, a lot of people are named after people in the Bible, right? Like we know a lot of people named David, James, Daniel, right? Matthew, Joseph, Hannah, Mary. These are very common names from biblical figures, but I don't know, have you ever met anyone named Job? I have never met anyone named Job. And I wouldn't be surprised if I never do. Why? Because his story is quite tragic, is it not? We're only in chapter 2 and it's already depressing. This guy was supposed to be the holiest, most righteous guy in all the earth. But yet it seems like God and Satan are working together to literally ruin his life. Now I understand why a parent wouldn't name their child Job, even though he kind of does have a happy ending to the story. We'll get there. But the bulk of the passage, starting in chapter 1, is him just getting beaten up by God himself. Why don't we want to name our children Job? Even though he is the godliest person, right? As Christians, we pray and we hope that our children would be godly people. Why? Right? Why don't we name them Job? Why do we name them Daniel and Moses and David, but not Job? It's because it shows that even in our hearts, even though we acknowledge what the Word says about Job's integrity and how godly he is, we hate suffering. Right? And if you like suffering, something's wrong with you. But normal people, just around the world, we will do a lot to avoid suffering. In fact, some may even say that that's kind of the point of life. Just practically speaking, maybe everything that we do is ultimately to avoid as much suffering as we can. The question we're asking today is, why do godly people suffer? Why do godly people suffer, right? It almost seems like you're not getting any reward for your devotion. Right? Job was this righteous, godly man. Even God himself is praising Job in the presence of Satan and all the other angels. He's saying there is no one as good as Job. But what good did it do for him? In fact, maybe it was his righteousness that caused the suffering, in a sense. Because if he wasn't this holy, righteous guy, then God and Satan maybe wouldn't have taken this opportunity to test him by literally destroying everything he ever loved. Why does this happen? Now, the answer to this question is very likely not going to satisfy you. It's not going to satisfy me. However, it is what the Bible teaches. It is the truth. It is the reality that we need to face. It is the hard pill that we need to swallow, even though we might not ever fully understand it. Even when we get to heaven, maybe we will never understand this. The central idea of today's text and the answer to our question is that God purposes suffering for the godly to test their faith and to reveal more of His glory. God purposes suffering for the godly to test their faith and reveal more of His glory. Now, the godly already have a sense of what God's glory is, or else they would not be devoted to Him. They would not trust in Him. They would not fear Him as Job did. But God purposefully doesn't just allow Job to suffer. He authorizes, He initiates the suffering upon the godliest man on the earth for these two reasons: to test Job's faith, and so that Job would see more of God's glory. Now you're sitting there, and you're probably just like me, thinking, that doesn't sound that great. That doesn't sound like it's worth it. Like, can't I just not be tested in my faith? Can't I just be okay with the amount of glory that I have seen of God? And that is a very natural human reaction, because we hate suffering more than we love God. And that's really the test of Job. Does he hate suffering more than he loves God? And we should also ask ourselves this question: do we love God more, or do we hate suffering more? The sermon in a sentence for us to take away today is that you must be steadfast in fearing and trusting the Lord regardless of the circumstances. That's really the moral of the story, if you will. That's really the takeaway of the entire book of Job in a nutshell. It was a test of Job's faith, not the quality of his faith, but whether his faith would endure through the suffering. It was a test to see if his faith was contingent upon the blessings he had received, or whether his faith was truly a personal love, fear, and trust in God himself, not just what God could do for him. Regardless of the circumstances, Job passed the test to a degree. He's humbled at the end of the book. Spoiler alert, Job goes through all of this. He doesn't sin in the first 2 chapters. He defends his righteousness even though others accuse him of wickedness. He knows he is innocent, and that is the whole conflict of the story, is that Job is innocent. But he has experienced the greatest suffering that anyone could imagine. And he demands an answer from God. He demands God to explain himself. He tries to put God on trial. And he's convinced that God has made himself an enemy to him rather than being his refuge. Now, as a reader, we long for the answer, right? We long for God to show up and say, here's why I did this, Job, and here's why it was worth it. But that's not how the story goes. Just letting you know ahead of time. God shows up and he asks Job a bunch of questions. He flips the interrogation back onto Job, and at the end of it, Job realizes where his place is, and he repents. In all of this, Job remains steadfast by turning to the Lord, by fearing him and trusting that whatever the solution, whatever the answer, whatever the lesson was, that it would come from God, not anywhere else. This is the core question of the story, is whether Job will be steadfast in his fear and reverence and trust in the Lord, or if he will succumb to his suffering and curse God rather than worship him. Before we jump into the text today, there's certain things that are important for us to know as we read the book of Job. So Job comes from the section of the Old Testament called the wisdom literature, the wisdom books. And these are 4 books: the book of Proverbs, the book of Job, the book of Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. Now, these 4 books are unlike any other books in the Bible. They're almost entirely poetic, and they work as a system. So the book of Proverbs, if you ever read Proverbs before, Proverbs is the book that explains wisdom in general, what you ought to expect out of life. And the overarching theme of Proverbs is, if you do well, if you honor God, if you obey God, blessings await you. If you are wicked, if you do bad things, if you hurt others, if you worship idols, if you commit sins, then God's wrath awaits you. That's the overarching theme of Proverbs. But these are not absolute truths. These are just general principles for what you ought to expect in life. And it's only with Proverbs at the foundation of the wisdom books that we can truly understand Job, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon, because these three books are exceptions to this rule that we see in the book of Proverbs. Job is the exception, that even when you do godly, even when you live the most godly life, you are not free from suffering. And on the flip side, it's implied that you could live a wicked life and still experience blessing. The book of Ecclesiastes is written from the perspective of a king who has everything, who has all the wisdom in the world, and he realizes all of it's meaningless, that none of it lasts, that at the end of the day, all that anyone has to truly enjoy is not material things or knowledge, but it is enjoying the life that God has given. And the book of Song of Solomon is contrary to what we see in Proverbs 2, the logical reasoning of right receives blessing and wrong receives punishment. The book of Song of Solomon is about the irrationality of love. So these four books work in a system, and the book of Job, as I mentioned, is the big contradiction, if you will, or the big asterisk to this principle that we commonly know of today as karma, right? Now, karma in Hinduism and Buddhism is more than just what goes around comes around. It has to do with the afterlife and reincarnation and all these things. But the essential principle of karma is not one that is originated in Hinduism and Buddhism. It's actually what we just all expect out of life. When you do well, you expect good things to happen to you. When you do bad, you expect bad things to happen to you, right? Play stupid games, win stupid prizes, right? If you do good, good will be done to you. This is what we expect in life. This is what we expect in relationships. And when this does not play out, this is when we have conflict. Here are some key principles to take away from the book of Job that are worth mentioning from the beginning and for us to be reminded of as we spend the next several weeks in the book of Job. Number one, God is absolutely sovereign over all. God is absolutely sovereign over everything. Nothing happens without God authorizing it. Now you might be wondering, well, what does that mean? What about natural disasters? What about the Holocaust? What about all the evils of cancer and all the diseases and all the droughts and famines and COVID? What about those things? Are you saying that God is responsible for all of those things? The short answer is yes. God is absolutely sovereign over all of reality. That's something we have to wrestle with as we read the Bible. The book of Job doesn't let us get away with just saying that Satan is responsible for all of the evil. God is sovereign over all. Satan is clearly subordinate to God and only can operate under God's sovereignty and restrictions. Secondly, God authorizes evil via Satan. Now, it seems like Satan is the bad guy in the book, right? And he is. He is so far in the story. He's trying to get Job, who's faithful to God. They have a good relationship, and Satan is coming in between. He's trying to compromise that relationship. What he really wants to achieve is he wants Job to curse God. That would be the win for Satan. That's his entire goal. But even as all this evil and calamity is happening upon Job, as you read through the book of Job, it is unanimous. Every single character, Job, his wife, his 3 friends, Elihu, all of them attribute the suffering of Job to God. None of them attribute it to Satan. God is the one who authorizes the evil via Satan upon Job. Third, the main focus of the book is the integrity of Job's relationship with God. Now, it might seem like this book is just very philosophical, and it is. Very conceptual and intellectual, and it is. But really, what's at the core of everything in this book is relationships. And the most important relationship is the relationship between Job and God. Satan's primary goal is to compromise Job's relationship with God through causing suffering. And God's goal, or God knows, that Job will not be compromised, even in the suffering. And number 4, this is the principle of karma, if you will, just the idea that good leads to blessing, bad leads to punishment. This is commonly known as the retributive principle, the principle of retribution, that you reap what you sow. And this is a principle that we see in the Bible throughout the book of Proverbs, throughout Deuteronomy. We see this throughout the Bible. But the 4th key principle in the book of Job is that the retributive principle is not absolute. It's not absolute. It doesn't apply to every situation. God remains the divine right to do whatever he wants. God reserves that divine right. Proverbs 11:5 says, "The righteous of the blameless keep his way straight, but the wicked falls by his own wickedness. The righteous of the upright delivers them, but the treacherous are taken captive by their lust." This does not apply to Job's situation. Proverbs 22:4, "The reward for humility and fear of the Lord is riches and honor and life." That did not play out in Job's life. Proverbs 28:15, "A greedy man stirs up strife, but the one who trusts in the Lord will be enriched." Seems like the opposite happened in Job's story. Proverbs 10:22, "The blessing of the Lord makes rich, and he adds no sorrow with it." Proverbs lays out what we would generally expect from life, but it's general, not absolute. And Job is the highlighted example of the righteous suffering, the innocent experiencing evil. So we should be confused. We are supposed to be confused. Today we're just dealing with the first 2 chapters of Job, which just kind of lay out the story. Just kind of lay out what's going to happen, why everything's happening the way it is. We have the introduction of Job's character in chapter 1, who he is, how righteous he is, how holy he is. Then the second part of the story, which is the bulk of the book of Job, is actually an ongoing debate between Job and his 3 friends. So after all this stuff happens with Job, think about it. He just lost everything. He lost 10 children. And then now he has this incredibly painful skin disease. And his friends come. They try to comfort him, but ultimately they all try to offer him counsel based on this retributive principle. And they all tell him essentially the same message. Job, you're suffering because you must have done something wrong. You must have sinned against God, and that's why he punishes you. Because there's no way that God would allow this to happen to you if you were truly righteous. Therefore, you must be wicked and you need to repent. So his friends ultimately become his accusers. And these three cycles of each of them speaking, Job is steadfast in defending his innocence before God. He's saying, no, that can't be it. That can't be it. And then what breaks that cycle is the voice of another friend, not one of the three, a fourth friend named Elihu. And Elihu rebukes Job and rebukes the three friends. And before Job has a chance to respond, God shows up in the next section. And God has several chapters where he's asking questions that nobody can answer. And then it leads to the resolution of the book of Job. Not the kind of ending you would expect, but it is the way it is. Suffering is a difficult thing to understand no matter what the circumstances are. But suffering is also just a reality of life. We are born in a situation of suffering. And from the moment you're born to the moment you die, a very pessimistic way to look at it is that you just have a series of suffering and some blessings along the way, but ultimately you die. Suffering is a universal reality for all of us, but not all suffering is the same. So as we read the book of Job, I think it's important for us to identify different kinds of suffering so that we don't falsely try to apply our situations to what's being said in the book of Job. So sin has consequences, right? Doing wrong, doing evil, committing crimes, it has consequences. If you do evil, you should pay for it, right? If you commit a crime, you should be brought to justice. You should pay a fine or go to jail or whatever the punishment is. You should suffer for your crimes. That's one kind of suffering. And that's the kind of suffering that Job's friends are accusing him of experiencing. The other kind of suffering is similar. If you disobey God, you should be disciplined. Right? This isn't so much as committing a crime, but you think of the story of Jonah. Right? Jonah is commanded by God to go on a mission, to go to Nineveh. Jonah says no. And God disciplines him by sending him in a storm, allows him to be swallowed by a giant fish. Can't imagine that being pleasant. Also, if you're just foolish in your decision making, you're going to suffer. Right? If you make bad decisions in life, they might not be morally bad decisions, but if you make poor decisions, like if you make bad investments, if you waste your time, if you're lazy, your life will have more suffering, more likely than not, right? And of course, last but not least, if someone sins against you, such as if someone stabs you, you're going to suffer. Right? That's another kind of suffering. When people sin against us, when we're the victim of other people's evil, that's causing suffering upon us. Now, out of all of these kinds of suffering I mentioned, this is not the kind of suffering that the book of Job is dealing with. None of these kinds of suffering. The kind of suffering that the book of Job is dealing with is specifically the suffering of the godly, the innocent sufferer. These are those unexplainable, unprovoked sort of evils that happen. Not just by someone else's sin, but it's like literally unexplainable why this is happening. And it's happening to someone who's innocent. It's not happening because they disobeyed God and God is disciplining them. It's not happening because they committed a crime 10 years ago and now it's coming around to bite them in the butt. That's not the kind of thing that's happening. So let's be careful when we try to hastily apply the things we see in Job into our own lives, because chances are, if you and I are facing suffering, it's probably due to one of the things that was mentioned above. Chances are. If we're suffering, if we're facing suffering now, chances are we made a mistake. Chances are someone else is sinning against us. Chances are we made a bad decision or something like that. This kind of suffering is rare because the kind of godly person that Job is very rare. Job's circumstances are unprovoked, and he is innocent It is not a consequence of his actions, but it is a calamity that is so irrational and unreasonable and unexplainable by the human mind. We're introduced to Job in chapter 1, and the way he's described is repeated 3 times in the text that we looked at today. He is blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. Wow, that's a great description. So great it makes me want to name my son Job if I stop reading right there. Right? Who doesn't want a child who's blameless and upright, one who fears God and turns away from evil? This sounds like the model human being. And he had a lot of blessings. He has 7 sons and 3 daughters. It's like the perfect number, right? 7 and 3. 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels. He had everything set up. One interesting thing is that Job isn't an Israelite. He's a man of the East. So he's a Gentile. But somehow he knows God. He knows the God of Abraham, the God of Israel. And God himself, once again, when he talks to Satan, he describes Job by saying, there is none like him on earth. What a compliment from God. Say, man, my man Job is so righteous. There's none like him. Job was not just a godly man. He was the godliest man on earth. But we must pause here and ask, what made him so godly? We'll look at the description. He feared God and turned away from evil. What does this mean? The word here, fear, isn't a fear of cowering away, a fear that causes distance, but a kind of fear that is of respect and reverence and awe that draws us towards a person, draws us towards a being in honor and respect for them. A major problem in modern Christianity is the false representation of God who is not fearful anymore. A false representation that God of the Old Testament was fearful and the God of the New Testament is just all about love. This is unbiblical. Nowadays, people who profess to be Christians come up with all different kinds of false interpretations of God, a God who's soft on sin, a God who doesn't send sinners to hell, a God who loves and is good but would never allow you to suffer, a God who is there for you and is your best friend, but he's not your Lord. He can't tell you what to do. He wants to respect your freedom of choice more than anything. These are unbiblical representations of God. Job feared God for who he truly is. This shows that Job actually understood the most important thing about God, that he was absolutely powerful and king, that God owed him nothing. That's what it means to fear God. When you fear someone the way Job fears God, the way we ought to fear God, we don't come to God with entitled attitudes. What modern Christianity and this when we have a God who is not fearful, what happens is that professing Christians live their lives without actually thinking about what God has commanded, what God can and will do, how God feels about sin, even in the smallest degree. You see, Job feared God so much, he had a regular habit of making sacrifices. See, when we fear God, we don't take sin lightly. And that's exactly what Job exemplified. It says he regularly offered sacrifices to cover the sins of his children. He had them consecrate themselves before God, and then he would offer sacrifices. For Job says in verse 5, he said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Job understands that sin isn't always outward action. He understood that sin is often an attitude of the heart. And he wanted to cover the sins, the potential sins of his children. This is someone who understands the gravity of sin. And this is at the heart of what it means to fear God and to turn away from evil. Because if you don't understand the gravity of sin, if you don't understand that sin leads to death, which is what is exemplified in a sacrifice, you will not flee from evil. Now, what does it mean that he was blameless and righteous? Well, what we know is that it doesn't mean that he never sinned, because everyone's a sinner. It means that he was living in constant repentance. He was constantly offering sacrifices to pay and atone for his sin. He understood that he needed God's forgiveness. This is what it means to fear God. To know that God owes you nothing, that you owe God everything, and that he is gracious and merciful to forgive you. In verse 6 of chapter 1, we see the first conversation with God and Satan. We read it together. It's almost exactly the same both times. When the Lord says to Satan, "From where have you come?" That's just the way people greeted each other in the ancient Near East. The same way in Korean, oftentimes people greet each other by saying, "Have you eaten yet?" They don't actually care if you've eaten. I mean, that's part of it, but it's just a way of expressing a greeting to someone, right? Or what's up, right? Like, what's that, So this is the way God and Satan are talking to each other. The Lord brings up Job first. It's not Satan. The Lord brings up Job first, describes him as this holy, blameless, upright man. No one's like him. And then what does Satan say? Does Job fear God for no reason? It's because you've given him everything. It's because you've blessed him. Essentially, what Satan's accusing Job of here is he's saying, Job only loves you because of what you can do for him. He doesn't actually love you, God. He doesn't love you. He just loves what you have. Essentially, he's saying Job is like a gold digger. He's saying Job is someone who is just going after the blessings of God, not God himself. And the Lord's confident in Job. He says, okay, I authorize you to take everything away from him. Just don't hurt him. And Satan goes out from the presence of the Lord, and he does exactly that. Before we go further here, there's certain things we must note about Satan. Satan is incredibly weak in comparison to God. The way the Bible describes God and Satan is not these two opposing forces and God just happens to win. The way the Bible describes Satan is that, yeah, he's more powerful than us as human beings, but he's totally subordinate to God. Think about this scene. God summons Satan as well as the other angels, and Satan has to show up. God tells Satan, you're allowed to do this and you're not allowed to do that. And Satan stays within those restrictions. What does this tell us? Satan is more like us than he is like God. Satan is more like you and me. He's more like a human being than he is like God. He is not this God of darkness and then Jesus and God are this God of light and they're clashing. That's not what's happening here. There's one God. There's one king. There's a bad guy. We don't really understand why God allows him to even exist. But we do know that God has a purpose behind his existence and that at the end, Satan will get the worst punishment and curse than anyone else. Satan is defiant and wicked, but he is totally subordinate under God's authority. Now there's great comfort in knowing that as powerful as Satan is, and as much as the Bible teaches us that the world, because of Adam and Eve's failure, is under the dominion of Satan, that there is a great and mighty God who is absolutely sovereign over everything that Satan does. Satan's greatest demonstrations of power, wickedness, and wicked people's greatest accomplishments of evil are ultimately insignificant in the grand scheme of things because of the God who's ultimately sitting on the throne. You can see that the king of darkness is no king before the true king. And Satan accuses God of not being worthy. That's ultimately what's hidden in his accusation of Job. He's not just accusing Job and saying, Job only loves you for what you've given him. he's ultimately saying, maybe you're not good enough for Job without your blessings. This is the focus of the entire story and the lens that we must examine ourselves under. Do we, as Christians, do we truly love God? Or do we just love what He has done for us? Yes, we praise God for what He has done for us. Yes, we love God for forgiving us, for calling us to be His children. Yes, we love God for giving us all the blessings that we experience in this life. But who will we be before God if everything is stripped away? Do we just love God for His blessings? Are we willing to receive evil that has been authorized by God and still stay loyal and faithful to Him? Look at Job's response. He said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Wow. Wow. Now I stand before you. I don't know if I could do that. I hope and I pray that I could do that with the power of God's Spirit transforming my heart. But if the Lord took everything away from me, man, how can you say that? Job is demonstrating a kind of faith that we should long for. Job is demonstrating that he understands that God owes him nothing. That him being born, him coming into existence, doesn't just merit all of this blessing from God. But how often do we just subconsciously expect that of God? That because we exist, God owes us a good life. See, Job understood this from before his suffering came, that he is owed nothing by God. Who will you be when all is stripped away? Does your confession, because we sing this in songs, right? Jesus, you're all that I need. God, you're all I want. You can have all this world, but give me Jesus. Does that confession actually carry its weight? And this is where we see the testing of Job's faith. You see, Job had all this blessing. God knew that Job would respond this way, but Job didn't know. But through this experience, Job was able to see where his faith truly stood. And this is why the Bible tells us, in the book of James, count it all joy when you experience trials and suffering of various kinds, because the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. We don't know the condition of our faith. We don't really know it until we face suffering, until we encounter evil, until things are taken away from us. That's when we really show our true colors. God's second conversation with Satan is very similar, except he adds, "Have you considered my servant Job? He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason." So God's not being fooled by Satan here. He knows exactly what Satan's up to. And this time he allows Satan to go after Job's health. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his feet to the crown of his head. And you think here, this is the breaking point. This is it. And even Job's wife, she's abandoned ship. This is the only line she has in the entire book. It's not a very good representation. He says, "Do you hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." What terrible advice, right? But let's be honest. That's so easy to identify with. We are more likely like Job's wife than Job. But Job does the right thing to correct his wife here. He says, you speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. If you're confused, that's okay. You should be. This book is supposed to be paradoxical. It's supposed to show this dilemma of the righteous in suffering. And we'll dive deeper into the content of this book, the arguments that are presented, and ultimately what God reveals about himself and what comes of Job and his fortune. For today, let's just take away these things. God is absolutely sovereign over all. Satan himself is subordinate to God. God authorizes evil via Satan. And the main focus of the book is whether Satan will be right in Job cursing God, or whether God will be right in Job holding his integrity. The retributive principle is not absolute. God has the divine right to do whatever he wills. Now, the bulk of the rest of the book is a theological debate between Job and his three friends who have no category in their understanding of reality. They have no category to understand suffering of the righteous, suffering of the godly. They don't have that space. So they just accuse Job of being wicked because that's all they have. That's all they have to give. And the scary thing about it is that they say a lot of true things as they present a false argument. Of course, the reason why Job is suffering is to show that there is this category of godly suffering. This concept is so contrary to our expectations and desires that we require an entire book devoted to it, like Job, to teach us on this matter. Whether we like it or not, God works in mysterious ways, and one of them is through the suffering of the godly. We may never fully grasp God's reasoning and purpose, but it is absolutely essential that we accept this truth, that God authorizes evil and suffering upon the righteous and godly, and somehow, through it all, whether we see the result or not, God accomplishes something immensely glorious and wonderful.